Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2. My name is Ciara Taylor, and I would like to start off this session with a song coming out of Minnesota with writer and singer Jeanne Kyle and Wes Burdine. It's called Hand in Hand, and it was written for Mike Brown. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. But while my sister ain't equal and my brother can't breathe, hand in hand with my family, we will fill these streets. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. But while my sister ain't equal and my brother can't breathe, hand in hand with my family, we will fill these streets. There's my sister marching with me. There's my brother marching with me. There's my father marching with me. There's my mother watching on till the people are free. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. But while my sister ain't equal and my brother can't breathe, hand in hand with my family, we will fill these streets. Mr. Policeman, I can't breathe, Mr. Policeman. I can't breathe, Mr. Policeman. I can't breathe. Weigh down your weapons and your badges and listen to me. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. But while my sister ain't equal and my brother can't breathe, hand in hand with my family, we will fill these streets. Maybe tomorrow I can truly breathe. Maybe tomorrow we'll have equality. Maybe tomorrow we can truly be free. Till then, my voice will fill these streets. Let the people be free. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. The day's gonna come when I won't march no more. But while my sister ain't equal and my brother can't breathe, hand in hand with my family, we will fill these streets. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Ciara, and welcome everyone to the second day of the Kairos Center Presents Moral Policy in a Time of Crisis, an online conference where we are looking at the major crises of our time: widespread poverty and economic insecurity, systemic racism, ecological devastation, militarism and the war economy, and the false narratives that keep these injustices in place, that blame the poor for their poverty, that distort religious teachings in support of unjust systems and structures. Yesterday, we heard from the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, from organizers and movement scholars and policy experts on how addressing these injustices is not just a question of policy, but of power, of organization, of building community and trust, and a movement that can exercise a power more forceful than anything we can do on our own. Indeed, the solutions we need are present. People who are on the front lines of these crises know what is necessary. Experts and scholars and economists and historians are telling us that it's possible, that pushing for new systems and new structures to be born is what we must do. And this is what we mean by moral policy. Policy is just a course of action that we commit ourselves to. Moral policy is something that can repair the harm that has been done and ensure that everyone has the right to live and thrive in this country. Today, we'll begin our second day of this conference with a panel moderated by Ciara Taylor on the long history of systemic racism. Ciara, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shelly, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited for this conversation. We have some amazing organizers and leaders from across the country joining us today to talk about this long history of systemic racism. And so I would like to start off by introducing our panelists for today, beginning with Leonardo Vilkis. He is a co-founder of Unión de Vecinos, a resident of Boyle Heights, and has over 30 years of experience as a community organizer. He worked at the UFW as a political organizing coordinator and at the Acorn as a political organizer. In the early 90s, he worked with Dolores Mission with Christian-based communities and was their lead organizer and educator. He was trained in liberation theology in Costa Rica, is a popular educator, and has conducted nonviolence trainings with Pase y Bene in Colombia and in various cities within the United States. We'll also be joined by Jeanne Theoharis. She is an author and co-author of 9 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post 9/11 America. Her biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won the 2014 NAACP Image Award, the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and was one of the 25 best academic titles of 2013 by Choice. And then lastly, but not least, oh, sorry, I have 2 more. We'll also have Wendsler Nosie Sr. He's a longtime opponent of Southeast Arizona Land Exchange and the former chairman and councilman of the San Carlos Apache tribe. And then lastly, Dr. Adam Barnes. He is the coordinator of the Rights and Religions program at the Kairos Center. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, and raised in Colorado, he has lived in New York City since 2006 and worked at the Poverty Initiative Kairos Center since 2007. In 2016, he completed a PhD in comparative theology at Union Theological Seminary. His dissertation investigates the liberative theology and spirituality emerging from anti-poverty struggles in the United States and a Sufi Muslim community in West Africa. And my name is Ciara Taylor. I am an educator and cultural organizer with the University of the Poor. And I would like to kick us off just thinking about the moment that we're in. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and in witnessing the devastation that followed the Watts Uprising in 1965, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. concluded that integration alone cannot save the soul of this nation. Once lamenting that there is no use to be able to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford something to eat, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others of his time realized that we can not only address systemic racism, but poverty, extreme militarization as well. We are living in a time of compounding crises. As the earth burns and over 220,000 people have died as a result of COVID-19, billionaires and millionaires continue to line their profits as their wealth has soared over the last 9 months of this crisis. As these inequities expand, so does the use of violence and the old adage of division politics, left versus right, white versus Black. As the media and politicians seek to divide us, we feel that it is imperative that our communities unite. And so we would like to start it off thinking about this long history of systemic racism with Wendsler Nosie to talk about the beginning of this practice. And before I do that, I would like to remind us that we have ASL and interpretation, Spanish interpretation as well, and that I ask the panelists to speak clearly and slowly and to speak one person at a time. And so without much further ado, I would like to pass it over to Wendsler Nosie. Thank you.
Good morning, can you hear me? Oh, okay. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. And like I've said many times, it's been long awaited. I guess what I've always said is that it's very important that we go back to the founding of this country. And in the beginning of everything we always do, we always go to the important things that God created to make sure we understand the world that we live in. And, you know, I sit back so many times and wonder, how do I get across to the people of this country to understand what they're not understanding? And when you come to the word assimilation, colonization, capitalism, it seems like that has a greater impact in American way of life. And those are really strong elements that really forces one or a group to change. And sometimes, well, from looking at that, you end up losing focus. And I guess what I always say is that, forgive me, you know, maybe this is the time I apologize, because this has to be heard. It has to be said. Because we go back to the rattlesnake. And the rattlesnake, for those that you know, have coils at the very end, the rattles. And when we look at the last coil, that's like here in America, that's points out the southern part of America, which is where I live in Arizona. And what we mean by that is that it's the last place of this so-called conquering and colonization capitalism. So we sit in this coil and we look at this whole world of how it evolved itself to be here. And so we speak from what we see of this whole entire misunderstanding about life. It's not that the people don't know it, it was taken away from them and created a new group of people. And so that's what scares us the most, is because in the prophecy, it also talks about the rattle. When the rattle shakes, it's a warning. And what we know is that in our holy places here, the holy places are rumbling. They're rumbling of what's happening in this world, and especially in this country. But then the prophecy also goes on that even worries us more so, is because one day it's not going to rumble anymore. And when that day comes, that means that we destroyed everything. And what frightened us here as Native people is that now we're seeing the rattlesnake begin to grow without rattles. And a lot of that is from the environmental impacts that are going on in this country. So many things are changing, and what's happening is that we're losing focus on what's happening around us because our minds have been trained elsewhere. So anyway, I tell people, you know, please just sit back and put yourself in our shoes and listen. Listen, because what we say here is, in Apache, there's a word and it's shiki. So when the first people migrated here to North America, the only word we had was that they were our relatives, they were our brothers and our sisters. There was no dividing lines, there was no discrimination. These people needed help to survive here. And the thing about it is that the conqueror never wants to write the true history. And if we were that kind of, because they were outnumbered when they came here. And if we wanted to do something really bad, we could have done that. But because there were people who were lost and didn't have knowledge about the earth. So in other words, in the morning or every day we get up, and with my grandkids and my my kids, we say, Nagosan ahie, Nina. So what that means in Apache is that it means to the mother, it's good to see you again. And the reason why we say that in our people, it reminds us who feeds us. It reminds us who takes care of us. It reminds us what a mother does. And so when I go around the country, I hear none of that. And it's scary because it creates a disconnection to what is the most valuable thing in the world. And then it worries us about where we're going and what we see and what's happening. So, but what we also say is that these people who came from the other side of the world, they know this already. It was already in them long ago before these colonizations happened in Europe and began to change the people. And so what we also say is that there's a person, and I know in the religious way, he's known as, well, for us, he's known as Jeanne, but he's also known as the Trickster in English. And so what we say is that this person had already toyed with the world in Europe already, but he already came here in a spirit, but because the people here was so spiritual that it nicked him and he felt it. And so he made a gesture to the people that he will return. And so the people, how would you say, prayed for this day to never come, but he did come back. And he came back through the way America is today, because back then we're talking about 90% of Native Americans being wiped out from the face of the earth. And so it was his last laugh to us for what our people did hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so anyway, when we look at America, this is what the people are facing. They're facing something really huge and evil that lives within the people. And what we say is that in order to begin to really fight it, is that those religious ways have to come from within, because it's already given to all of us, but to have it come within and out, then the oldest ways can begin to counter this evil that we are facing. But if we do it with anything modern, the modern stuff to us, it doesn't work, because what this old creature understands is what is old from the beginning, and that's what it fears the most. So for Indian people, we look at how, and like I said, this is where I tell people, put yourself in our shoes, is because we see how the French and their colonized people colonize it above us, above America, which is Canada. We've seen how the Russians migrated from Alaska down into the west coast of Canada and into California, what is California today, and how they ended up just near San Diego. And then we see the Spaniards who came from down below us. Then we see the white people from England and their partners who came right across into this country. So we've seen this mass migration taking place. But in our first encounters with all these people, the thing that they were looking for was gold. Gold to accommodate their countries with the way the Europeans were set up. And it was all about natural resources. It was all about what can they take. But when they found the value of this country, then things turn. And that's where all this American history starts, with the 13 colonized from the east and how it all migrated towards us. So we've seen that. And within that, we've seen a lot of death taking place, a lot of transition happening. And then what really scares us today, and again, no offense to nobody, but the American flag really, when they talk about the flags down south, the federal Confederate flags, what some of these flags represent. Well, for us, if you look at the flag, when they were conquering this country, they were putting stars in this flag. So there's an Arizona star in there that represents the conquering of our people, the devastation that we went through, the atrocities, the criminal acts. And so that's what the American flag stands for. So it really bothers when you see people loyal to it and really standing for it. And that kind of tells us that, and that's kind of comes to like suppressing, being suppressed, because it's a reminder that we try to do or stand up for our rights. The flag waving in front of us reminds us, you better be quiet, you know? So there is that suppressing the people, and why the older people, the elders and those who have gone were afraid. They were afraid to speak up because they remember all the atrocities. And what people tend to forget is that the reservations are homes of a prison. So imagine going to a prison and then them telling you, okay, now this is where you got to live. And so the reservations became a prison. And then from there, it's the reservations today. So that whole area, the area that we live in, is a suppressed place because we don't have the same opportunities that the Americans have. The commercials we see don't apply to us. Mortgage of homes don't apply to us. Business don't apply to us. So we're still being suppressed big time from how the country was created. And this is where these laws came into play that now affects everybody across the country. So in my tour, when I was heading to Washington to bring this attention, one of the first trips that I made was that I was going to meet a lot of my Native brothers and sisters and talk to them. I mean, I did do that, but the majority that I did meet was non-natives. And as I moved east, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time we had six miles to go to the Capitol, an elder white lady and an elder white man stopped us because we were running all the way. And they said, are you the ones that we've seen on Facebook? You guys are coming from Arizona and you guys are Apaches. And so we said, yeah, that's us. And I remember her statement changed me forever, because what she said to me was that she said to me, she goes, you're going there. And she was pointing towards Washington, because like I said, we're about 6 miles away. And she says, when people get elected and they go there, before they get elected, they're good people. She goes, they're really good people. She goes, but when they get there, something happens. So in all my life and my family, we look at that place as a dark hole. Something evil sits in there because it changes everybody. And so she says to me that, she goes, I'm sorry, I can't really stand with you, but my spirit can. My spirit can stand with you. And let me jump on your back, because the greatest sin of this, all of it's sin, she goes, but the greatest sin in the beginning was what they did to your people and how they did it. Because that's when it opened here, she goes. And we're never happy about it. So if anything I can do in my life, she said, I'm 92 years old. If anything that I can do in my life is know that I jump with you on this battle spiritually. And so I always remember my last mile to the Capitol. I realized that it's not just about us, it's about everybody. It goes back to the very beginning, of how people came here, how they initiated the move and what they were taking and then what they wanted for themselves. So, what we face today when we look at this whole picture is that we look at how the owners of this country versus the poor of this country, they have no, because of this evil, they have no feelings to what is happening, because it's all about ownership, because that's what we experience from them taking and taking and taking and taking. And then today, ignore the whole conversation, ignore it all, that it never, ever existed. And that's why we said that when you try to build a foundation on a lie, the lie will catch up. And so when we look at today, what the people had prophesied was that it's going to all catch up. It's going to reoccur because they don't listen to their own history. They don't look at what happened in their lives. But now they came to America. And the way we look at the country here is that, I know people go back to like the Bible, they go through the verses and stuff, they get inspired by that. But for us, when we look at that, we say that, don't they see that those people who were suffering from all this ugliness that was happening in Europe, that a spirit brought them here for healing, for a new chapter, a new way. But the evil was upset at us for what we did to it thousands of years ago, that it did what it did to us, but we survived. So within the different people, there were good people that we all survived. And that's how the country should have been built on, because from that point, it would have been example throughout the rest of the world. But this evil that we're talking about is trying to not allow that to take place because of where it originated and where it came to be and how it's upset of what the creation is. Because we go back to the very basic, and the very basic is the Mother Earth. You know, we can't do nothing without the mother. And if we destroy the mother, we destroy ourselves and everything that's a gift from the creator. And so what we're trying to do, and that's why I'm real grateful to the Poor People's Campaign, because we've never had a national platform. We've never had people ever listen to us, because when I still meet some people, they refer back to the Western movies they watch. They refer back to what the federal government says, you know, like we just want handouts and all this other stuff. So they describe the outline of our people to the rest of the world. And yet we hold an abundance of information that we can provide. So anyway, what really worries me today is we go back to the environment. Nothing can come from if we destroy the environment. And we got to come to a point where enough is enough, and we have to be satisfied with what we have. And we realize that. But one of the most important things is that what this country needs to understand is that this environment is spiritually, and it intertwines with everything that we do. And if we destroy it, there's nothing for us. And then, like right now happening in Arizona, we're talking about the copper mines taking every water. And I feel real bad because a lot of these places, you know, they're programmed not to even understand it. They're programmed, you know, they go right by all these tailings and they don't see a waste. You know, they don't, it just really blows you away because they're programmed. They're so strongly programmed. But it comes back to what we preach about capitalism. Because one of the things that we see is that from our family, we can go from our immediate to extend it to the second, third, fourth, fifth. And that's why we're so big, is because we keep our family ties together. But what we see in this capitalist world is that it's trying to break us from family. Because if your family is broken, then what's happening to your second, third, fourth relatives, it doesn't matter to you because you're disconnected. But if you're not disconnected, then everything matters. And so when we look at these federal policies, who does it accommodate? It accommodates capitalism. It accommodates that way of life versus the people who are suffering. And as long as we're voting people in to enforce or reinforce new laws that accommodate them, then the poor will always be the poor. The suffering will always be the suffering. And it really blows us away because here, when somebody's trying to start a business and it starts to go down, even the competitors come help so that they don't lose their business. But in this world outside the reservation is that they're happy if somebody on the other side of the street business goes down because they look at profits. And so when you look at the capitalist world, you know, it really dominates. I was in Great Falls, Montana, and I was invited to a council meeting, and it really blew me away because there was a bunch of non-Indians. It was all white men and white ladies in the meeting. And they called me in because they were pushing mining in Montana and in Great Falls. And what they were talking about was trying not to bring big corporations in because big corporations will begin to dictate the little town. And so they were fighting that. And it really, on one side of me, I was really happy because they seemed to understand that once you give it away, you're not ever controlling it. Because when you come to big corporations, they control everything. So anyway, I guess my point is that, you know, that I'm glad what this country is doing today. You know, it is so true. There's got to be a new narrative. There's got to be a new birth. And what we call is healing. We have to take a look at ourselves. if we don't take a look at ourselves, how are we going to heal? You can't look at other people and then describe the antidote of that's the healing. No, you have to look at yourself. Each people have to look at themselves and begin to heal. Because here in San Carlos, we've done that. We had to look at, and we realized that we were victims. We're victims. We're victims of the past. And we still carry that. So there's two ways we can do it. We could do it with anger. We can suppress ourselves, or we can begin to recognize that and say, hey, wait a minute, wait, we have to choose a role of what we were prior to all these people coming to America, because we were not like that. We weren't people who were hated or hated anyone or killed anybody. We weren't those people. But this way of life created a new type of Native Americans, but it left us in a position that, these two roads were ugly. And so like what we're trying to do now is come back to say that this is who we are, and we got to maintain that so that our kids will know who they are. So I don't know how much time I have left. So I think that, with what we're doing today, like I was telling my family, this is a really great opportunity for the country to really develop a good narrative, to really look at how colonization, capitalism work, and to be honest about it. Because as long as we're not honest, then we're not really fixing the foundation of this country. And then to go back to the way the Indian people looked at how the world was changing, that the people came here because of all the atrocities, and then people were taken away from over there to be labored here. And so now that we all know that history, then we need to fix it, because in all people have a religion, no matter what it is. But that's where they need to come to the point and understand that we're all brothers and sisters, and we can fix this. And because if we go back to that blessed gift, the blessed gift really gives us that opportunity. But if we work our way away from it and turn our volumes down, then we don't hear it. And that's why I was saying it was important, because there's like issues here in Arizona and rightful issues when it comes to the school, health. And so they're pushing pressure on Arizona. They want all this extra money. But then Arizona behind their back is putting it in the bill to take it from the natural resources. And those natural resources will destroy more land, more water. And they don't want to touch their revenue, but they'll kick it off and take it even in the world of devastating like the environment. And that's why with this country, diluting the environmental policies scares us, because they forgot how toxic the air was becoming, how polluted the rivers were coming. So when those laws came into place, as Native people, we're happy about it, because it began to settle these possibilities of it coming quicker and destroying the West faster. But now that we're talking about and they're celebrating in this country that by lessening environmental policies, that more jobs are created. But hey, let's be smart. That's what's killing us. That's why we have high health issues. There's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of death happening. I mean, there's a lot of illegal things that came from that seem to have shut the door and covered up. But with the work I'm doing, it's re-exposing everything that has happened to the people here in Arizona when it comes to mining, and then the water issue of how it's going to affect the whole Southwest. And then having my little meetings in Washington, they tell me, get ready, because the southern part of America is going to be a wasteland. And so there's people in the north talking about future policies before people migrate up north, because that's where all the water is going to be. And so when you have those meetings with these people who work in these fields, they were telling me, as the chairman of the tribe, that be ready, because it's all about revenue. And then we come back to the one agency, the National Forest Service. And I just wanted to hit on that real quick, was that, it's an agency from the United States that, protects the land base. So we're all brought up that it's a great agency, watches the land, the forests, all this stuff. Well, anyway, if you go to the definition of it, they just monitor the revenues. How much revenues can they take, from these national lands that are held there in trust for the United States? So as corporations today go after all these national places, then we're diluting, we're destroying, and we're taking all these things away from our kids because it's either state or privately owned. But once the national places are taken and they're given to private sectors, corporations, then that's totally lost in the future. And that's what America needs to pay attention to, because that's all of our last lands that will take care of us. And in these lands like Oak Flats and Mount Graham, the two places I'm fighting about, well, these are mounds. So what happens is that from Mexico, from the Gulf of California, Mexico, when the weather comes in, these mounds are so high that they're like knives. They carve the clouds. And when they carve the clouds move in different directions, and it gives their moisture where they should go naturally. So it's a human being itself showing where it should go to feed its environment. And so with Oak Flats, them going to destroy that, you're talking about 184, the temperature rising to the surface of the earth. You're talking about 10 degrees hotter in a 50-mile radius. So what they're not saying is that when the moisture moves, the clouds move over the top, it's going to disappear. So the moisture will never reach where it should be going because it'll all burn off there from how hot it is. So we're changing the environment, right in front of us. It's happening. And that's why I say it's so important for them to keep us out of the equation and talking about this, because it'll educate the people more, because we have that historical records from the beginning. And as long as we're left out, it will never be a part of the equation of how we could really heal and fix this place. Because, the experts get their degrees, but for us, to us, it's a degree, because that's been passed on from generation to generation to generation about how the earth works, how the mother works. And so like we're taught in the religious sense about prayer, that the Indian people here were given the knowledge of the mother, the earth. And then the white people were given the knowledge of fire. And they were given that. And if you look at what they do, everything's with a spark. Everything is with fire. And then the Asian people were given the power of wind. They can converse with the creator. And then the Black people were given the power of water. And so for me, when we come all together in that sense, we can relate to each other, because it's important, because that's what makes up the blessed gift. And we pray that that day will come. Everything else comes from that. And we pray that, we'll come to that, we'll come to that point. And like when I say this, you have the Mexicans saying, well, why didn't you mention us? And I'm like, I did. Our sisters were raped down in Mexico from the Spaniards. We're all intermixed now, and from all these atrocities that happened. So when I speak of this, I'm speaking for you, because we claim you. You're native to this land. You're native. Like us. You're no different than us. Your mother is the same mother I had. They're all tight. So we're all intertwined. And that's why I was saying that why this part of the world is so blessed, because we could really change the narrative for a better tomorrow, because we're all one people. But we have to come to that point and understand it. So anyway, I think that that today is real crucial for everybody in this country, because we also see it as an opportunity for this narrative. We see it as a new beginning. We see it as a healing. We see it as a new birth. But those of us, I believe, that are doing this work, and the leaders that believe, we can't quit. Even though results may go good, where there is a better tomorrow coming, we have to really build on that. We cannot sit back. But it's important to really educate our children. And I'll leave you with this. My mother used to say, if you want to change the future, it's going to be your children. It's going to be the one that are not born. Because it goes back to our people. When our people were first lined up and the soldiers were playing catch, and the ball rolled to the child. And Goriyatha, which is Geronimo, a very inspirational person to us that defended the land, he says to the people and to the young boy, don't touch it. Because if you touch it, that will change you and you'll be dirty. And we never really knew what that meant. But now we know, I mean, at that time, they looked at him with fear when he said that. But it all makes sense today because everything that we touch that is destroying the Mother Earth, we're contributing to it. We're dirty now. So he reminded us that what he was saying was this colonized ways that's coming, this corporate way that's coming, is once you touch it, you're dirty, and you have to understand it. You cannot act like you're clean. You're dirty. Then you got to find a way. And that's kind of what he said, that when he was passing, then it was said that a man said, you had to have lived a hard life, for what you went through. But Geronimo turned around to him and said, no, I fear more for you, because you're going to be fighting for your identity with this new world that has come. And it's going to undercut you. So don't worry about me. I worry about you and the children yet to come. And I think that's something that, I live really hard by, because I worry about what tomorrow is going to be. And that's why I tell people that it's going to take our children to change tomorrow, but we have to be strong teachers to it. We have to be strong people to admit and not to pretend, and I think that's one of the greatest things that my mother told me when I was out there saying, I'm Apache, Nestle, yeah, I'm Apache, saying all this stuff. And then finally, when she took me aside, she goes, no, I gave you the disease. She says, you're a victim like our people. You're going to have to find healing before you say that. Find yourself. Because if you keep saying that, you're going to have anger. You're going to be mad. But something happened to us. But now you're going to have to find the answer so you could teach your children, because they're better than that. We were holy people. We were people who understood the creation of the blessed gift that God gave the world. So in ending, I'm happy with all the people I've met throughout the country that has accepted us, because we have a religion. The conqueror didn't want it to be defined as a religion. And that's how come they have that discovery, the doctrine of discovery, which gave them the right to eliminate us from the face of the earth. And that was a religious act that was done to give the military people. And so it seemed like from that point, we were never classified as people for them, that we had a religion. But when I go back and look at Europe, when I went back to the very beginning and talked to so many people, about the very beginning about Christianity, there's a lot of similarities. And then when I went to North Carolina, Winston-Salem, and they had a mural, and the young lady was, because we were there visiting the school, and she was doing the mural, and then I stopped her halfway and I said, can I finish the story for you? And she looked at me and she says, okay. So I finished telling the story, and then she looked at me and she goes, did you ever take any kind of African culture school class? And I looked at her, I said, no. I said, what you're describing in Africa is the same here. It's the same thing. And she was just really shocked. I said, it's the same. I said, that's what's missing in all of us, is how everything originated. And then if we ever go back to that, we'll find that we interacted together, and it's one religion, it's one. But what I feel bad is we're forgetting about the Mother Earth. We don't have greetings to her, because every time we walk out that door, she's the one that is nourishing us. And so the last parts of what's happening here in America, through these federal policies and through the people, I don't say so much Congress. They're just the doers for the ones that control this country. They don't know that they're killing females. So when we talk about Mount Graham, Oak Flats, when the Native people talk about these sacred places, they're female mounds. These places are places that you can be born and you can die as an old age person, because it has everything there. Anything else around it or down below, those are not females. Those are what we call the givers of life. And that's what the elders before that have passed were really worried about, because she said, these people are destroying these places that gives us life. And once they're destroyed, there'll be no more.
Thank you so much, Brother Wendsler.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for opening us up with that first chapter. You're so right. Sankofa, you are an African religious person as well. Sankofa, us needing to look back in order for us to move forward. And when we talk about systemic racism, we are talking about a system. We're talking about a system that has evolved. And like you brought to us, it has evolved from this place of genocide and colonization and continues to exert its violence among the poor and dispossessed in order to maintain and further their profit. And so I want to pass it over to Jeanne Theoharis. Jeanne, I just want to say I really love your piece on white liberalism and Dr. Martin Luther King's Jr.'s critique of that liberalism. And so can you talk a little bit more about that with us?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And in some ways, I want to pick up Wendsler's point about the need to be honest, right? And what an honest history is. And I teach a class on the civil rights and Black power movements at Brooklyn College. And sometimes I start with a trick question, which is, what was the largest civil rights demonstration in the 1960s? And obviously, because I'm asking the question, students get a little nervous because what they want to say is the March on Washington, right? Because that's what we know, right? That's the big one. There's 250,000 people in DC, but that's not the answer. The answer is actually the next year, in February of 1964, almost 500,000 students and teachers stay out of New York City public schools to protest the fact that we're 10 years after the Brown decision, and yet New York City doesn't even have a plan for desegregation, let alone desegregation. And the schools in New York are segregated. They're growing more segregated because if we're thinking about where we are in American history, right, we're seeing increased migration both from Puerto Rico, from the island into the city, and African Americans from the South into places like New York. So schools are getting more segregated, they're getting more overcrowded, they're getting more underfunded, they're getting more under-resourced. In fact, in parts of New York City, they've gone to double session days in Black and Latinx schools because they don't want to rezone so that Black students and white students would go together. So here we are, the biggest civil rights demonstration of the 1960s, and yet I think many of us have never heard of it, right? It's not the way, even though the civil rights movement is one of the few things that make it into our textbooks, it's one of the few moments where we talk about race in US history. In fact, the ways we see the civil rights movement and what we don't see about it, I think has a lot today for us in terms of how to think about the nature of racism, of structural racism in this country, right? Because I think part of the way that we've come to see the civil rights movement is that the racist is the Klan. It's the White Citizens Council, right? It's people spitting and burning crosses. And that is absolutely one facet of what racism looks like, but it's also only one facet. And that a lot of the resistance to school desegregation, to housing desegregation, to changing how law enforcement worked came in much more, and I'm going to use Dr. King's words, polite form. 3 months after the Watts uprising, Dr. King takes to the pages of the Saturday Review, which was one of the big magazines of the time. It's not with us anymore. And he writes, "In my travels in the North, I have become increasingly disillusioned with the power structures there, who welcome me to their cities and shower praise on the heroism of Southern Negroes. Yet, when the issues of local injustice are mentioned, when the issues were joined concerning local conditions, only the language was polite. The rejection was firm and unequivocal." And King is saying this, and again, this is a King that we're not so familiar with. King is saying this in 1965 because, in fact, in the years before the Watts uprising, King had crisscrossed the country partly to raise money for the Southern movement, but also to join with and stand with Northern struggles, challenging school desegregation, challenging housing segregation, challenging police brutality. And in fact, King goes on to write, as the nation, Negro and white, trembled with outrage at police brutality in the South. And I think we can think of Birmingham. Police misconduct in the North was rationalized, tolerated, and usually denied. So again, here's a King that we're not as familiar with, and here is a way of thinking about sort of both what the civil rights movement was taking on that I would argue looks more like a lot of the racism we fight today, which is that if we look at a place like New York City, if we look at a place like LA, if we look at a place like Seattle, if we look at a place like Detroit, you don't see people opposing the civil rights movement in the city on the grounds of segregation now and forever, right? Like George Wallace is doing in Alabama at that same point. What they're saying is something a little bit different. And King, again, is going to zero in on this, right? First, you see people, liberals, saying, we don't have a problem here. What do you mean? Prove it. We don't have segregation. We have separation. Secondly, they say, we're colorblind. We don't see color here. We don't even keep records. We don't know. We don't even know who goes to school where. We don't keep those records. Third, and I think most dangerously, what you see Northern liberals saying to, in many ways, justify and explain the inequalities in their cities in the face of a growing civil rights movement is they say certain communities don't value education the same way. Certain communities are plagued by crime. Certain communities don't have the right values for success, right? And so you see these cultural, what we could call a culture of poverty arguments being made to justify deep inequalities in education, deep inequalities in the job market, deep inequalities in policing. And over, we see Dr. King trying to call it out. And similar to the Northern activists he's standing with in the early 60s, they're being ignored. They're being called troublemakers. They're being called unreasonable. In fact, going back to that 1964 school boycott in New York, the New York Times editorializes against that boycott and they call it unreasonable, reckless, and violent, right? So many of the terms we see used today against our protests are often language that we see liberals using against movements in their own cities, even if at the same time they are supporting a civil rights movement in the South. And so I think going back to Wendsler's point about honesty, part of being honest about what our history looks like and what the civil rights movement looks like. And again, I would argue that the civil rights movement is now one of the most lauded periods of American history. And if you surveys show that if you ask kids, young people, who the most famous Americans are, except for presidents, the people they pick are King and Rosa Parks. And yet the history we are given misses in many ways much of the opposition to those movements. So what did white parents organizing against school desegregation call themselves in New York in the 1960s? They called themselves parents and taxpayers, right? They're not calling themselves pro-segregation. They called themselves, we're not racist, we're just against busing, right? And busing is going to be one of the lenses with which Northerners find a more palatable way to oppose school desegregation. Now, why am I telling you this? Part of why I'm telling us this is because this history shapes the Democratic Party we have today. So where does Senator Joe Biden get his start in the 1970s? He gets his start protecting the interests of white parents by helping to pass multiple laws, multiple anti-busing laws, multiple laws that say, we're not going to bus kids. We're not going to do things like school pairings, right? Because this is the language that Northern liberals have kind of claimed to talk about why they don't want desegregation. And then we see people like Senator Joe Biden take up that mantle of sort of white suburbanites in Delaware, but also across the country, to kind of bring that into legislation. Similarly, around crime, one of the ways that we see parents thwart movements around desegregation in cities like, you know, New York, Boston, LA, is by saying these neighborhoods are dangerous. We don't want these kids going. What we need is more policing, right? And you see this resort to these, there's crime there, and again, we have King taking on that, right? He says, in one of my favorite quotes, he says, when we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by the law. Day in and day out, he flagrantly violates building codes. His police make a mockery of the law. And I want us to hear Dr. King. His police make a mockery of the law. And he violates laws on equal employment and education and the provisions for civic services. So again, King is calling out the ways that a second tactic, the first tactic is anti-busing, right? That becomes the way to shut down like substantive school desegregation, even though kids are being bused in all of these districts beforehand and white parents don't object. The second is crime. And you see, in fact, the escalation and expansion of police forces in the 1960s. You see the expansion of school policing. And then you see, again, the Democratic Party picking that issue up. And when we get to the sort of Clinton era, right, with the 1994 crime bill, with the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, right, the expansion of criminalization and the curbing of rights of defendants, right? The third thing is to cast sort of public assistance and a kind of social citizenship as freeloading and racializing it, right? So you see this rising movement against public housing and welfare that culminates again in the 1990s with Clinton passing both the 1996 welfare reform law and then 2 years later, the Quality Housing and Work Reconciliation, which targets public housing, right? So the kind of stripping of the social safety net by claiming this kind of racialized picture of public assistance and that people are dependent and freeloaders. And so I think if we're gonna have an honest history, part of that honest history is reckoning with the full measure of opposition to the civil rights movement and the strategy and the full measure of strategies that people undertook to try to thwart a kind of rising movement, not just in the Deep South, but in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and on the West Coast, and using the strategies of policing, criminalization, anti-social assistance, and kind of rights of taxpayers as the kind of new language of kind of race in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to just shift it over, and I've really just enjoyed this conversation and the attention that's being given to us, you know, being honest about this truth, being honest about the culture, you know, that we have in this country. And so I want to shift over to Leonardo and Adam to just talk more about how do we actually organize within a racist system to change it, you know, to actually end it, to actually, you know, be able to unite our people to fight and to win for dignity, for the right to life for all people. So, Leo, do you want to start us off? So I'll pass it off to Adam. Adam, can you talk more about the work of the Kairos Center and how you all have been challenging systemic racism?
Sure. Thank you, Ciara. And yes, I just want to underscore my appreciation of this conversation and this whole gathering. I mean, I really, I think it's easy, and maybe for a long time we talk about unity and we talk about coming together and changing things, but there are these moments in time and in history moments where our ears are a little more open to listening, our feet are a little more ready to walk, and as Wendsler said, this is what we need. Like, this is the moment, and so if we miss it, it would be horrible. So I think this type of conversation and all of those that are watching and joining this conversation know that there is an opening for truly transformative change. And one of my mentors, Willie Baptist, says that it's always a combination of both the conditions, the reality that we're living in, which has been building for a long time, and the consciousness, the place of where people have come to see what they have come to see. And when those things come together, that's when true change happens. So the campaign, I think, is living into that moment as well. We kind of inherit the work that Dr. King was doing at the end of his life. And when he built the Poor People's Campaign, he talked about systemic racism as a part of, as an evil, as one of three evils, militarism and systemic poverty. And we add the fourth evil of ecological devastation. But I think the truth remains that, that it's important to call it out as an evil. And so there's that part, that it's an evil, but also that he saw it as an evil that was inseparable from other evils. So the way King described it was as a triplet evil. And as we know, triplets are born of the same mother. Their DNA cannot be, any closer than any other being in the world. And yet there are slight differences, and they depend on each other in different ways. So there's a very organic, deep relationship between these evils. And the second part of it is that calling it an evil is almost a spiritual term. It's not just a.
Let's see if I.
Uh-oh, now we got Leonardo. You're working now. I'll wrap it up. Yeah, so as an evil, we have to approach it not just, as a policy, but as a deeply principled value question of who we are and what we've become. And when you approach it in that way, it becomes much more, the approach becomes much deeper and much broader. And so just to kind of move into a little bit of the practical ways that looks. I mean, we look to history as a model of to learn what will work and what doesn't work. And we've seen throughout history that when true change starts to happen, people come together across these lines of differences. In the US, you have examples like the Southern Tenant Farmers Work Union. You have examples like even during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, or the Bonus Army March right after World War I, where folks were coming together across these lines of divisions out of necessity. And so we see that the model works, and that's why we take it up. And also the other element of it that we've seen that works is following the leadership of those who are most impacted. By taking our direction and trajectory from those who have embodied these evils, and then have turned it around and fought back. There's a clarity of understanding of what it is that we're facing, and a clarity of which direction we have to go and how far we have to go before we stop. So those are the lessons of history, and how they look practically within the campaign these days is a lot of different ways. I mean, for one, what we do in terms of organizing, one key element is the testimonies, is the listening to people's stories and bringing certain people together in rooms with other people that may not have been together before, probably intentionally, and then when they are together, they can hear each other's stories and start to understand why one liberation is tied to another. Marching obviously is important. I'll never forget in DC during the 40 days when I was helping to marshal a group down for an action, and you look down in this group of people, like I think the tourists in DC must have been wondering whether I was leading a tour group myself. It was just such a random group of people. But there they are, old, young, different religions, different races, from different parts of the country, talking together, walking together into a putting their bodies on the line into to try and live a new way. So the marching, the testimonies, and then I think also the study, the way that we the way that we're going to beat this, the way that we're going to win is by understanding the ways that the forces we're up against continue to divide us and continue to find ways to break us apart and pit us against each other and oppress us differently at different degrees of oppression. And so study is an important element of how we organize. We know we march, but we see marching as a way to learn, as a way to understand what we're up against. We worship and have cultural events, not just as a way to keep ourselves entertained, but as a way to understand our history and understand our past and reflect more deeply on the struggle ahead. So all of this, I think, is what helps to do that incredibly difficult thing of bringing people together across lines of differences. And it takes time. It takes a sustained, which is why the 40 days was a sustained period of civil disobedience, and why we know, as Wendsler said, we're doing this not just for ourselves but for our kids, and over time, only through over time can these changes come about, but and through a constant level of action, and continued and consistent level of action. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll just end it there to say, when we talk about this form of organizing across lines of division, this fusion organizing as being spiritual, really what that means is not, that we're trying to make it that this is a religious movement in the terms of you have to be religious to be part of the movement, but that the idea of spirituality is defined as how you walk with God. And so it really is just a way of being. And so at the core of it, the movement is about taking a lead from those who have been oppressed, those who have been marginalized, and understanding and looking and listening and seeing through their activity and their resistance a new way of being, a new way of walking with God. And that's where I feel like we're headed. So I appreciate the time, and I'm encouraged by all of the leadership here. So I'll end it there and let Leonardo.
Thank you so much. And yes, Leonardo.
So you can hear me now?
I can hear you now. I'm so sorry. But many people talk about racism as a Black versus white, a North versus South. You're out there in Los Angeles. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you all have tackled the issue of systemic racism in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Los Angeles in a large immigrant community. And I think the first reality that we need to understand is that this country was built on stolen land, with slave labor and the exploitation of migrants. And if we understand that, racism, systemic racism, as we're talking about it, is embedded in the history. And if it's embedded in the history, it's embedded in the systems, the institutions, and the ways that we operate within the country. And at the same time, if it's embedded in those processes and those systems and institutions, it is also part of our language. And here in Los Angeles, and probably in lots of parts of the United States, we're hearing that the notion that the growth of this system, of this country, is about development. And development can mean many things to a lot of people. And when we go back to Adam's question about when we do change, when we do things, we need to focus on those who are most affected. it is very important then to understand that if we were to talk about development, we cannot talk about development that doesn't include the people who are most affected, the people who have been excluded by history. We cannot talk about a development that doesn't address the historic demands and needs of the people. We cannot address a development that ignores the existence of individuals. And to give a concrete example, in our community, we live in Boyle Heights, and it's a community that pretty much was built by racism. Los Angeles was a segregated community where only white people could live, basically. And in our community in Boyle Heights was the place where everybody else was moved into. The Jews, Japanese, immigrants, Mexicans, African Americans. I don't know if I mentioned the Japanese. So over time, this community became one of the most diverse communities in Los Angeles, in the city. And then through other changes in history, like the Japanese internment camps, discrimination, and another form of segregation, this became a very Mexican community. So over time, this neighborhood that was built through racism became a Mexican community that was segregated from the rest of the city in a way. And now, through development, quote unquote, we're being asked to reintegrate into the city. And that's what we call gentrification. And so now the city and the investors and the politicians who are invested in the development of the city and growth are saying, well, it's time for you guys to integrate into the city. And we've been confronting lots of different kind of plans to grow the city, to build more housing, to do all sorts of things, but they're not addressing the needs, as I was saying. They're not asking the people who live in this community, what is it that you need? What is it that you were lacking? What is it that we were doing to you that created these conditions? So they come to us and say, we need to build galleries. And when we say no to the galleries, they, as Jeanne was telling us, they're accusing us of being rude, of being disrespectful. When we confront the development of housing that doesn't serve the needs of the most poor, we confront this. So I think the important thing, and especially when we talk about housing, is to think of the bring everybody together. When we talk about housing, we're not talking about just housing for Mexicans or immigrants or African Americans. We're talking about housing for all, for the homeless and people who are excluded. So it is important to find and develop alliances across everybody who was most affected. It is important to fight for being part of the planning processes that are developing. But not only that, it is important to look beyond what's being built. So if we talk about development, we cannot talk about development that is built in terms of the planners, in terms of the politicians, in terms of the people who are telling us what development is. It needs to start anew. It needs to start under a new system. It needs to start with a different gathering of people, and with a different kind of building a new kind of history. And I think it is very important, because when we think at the moment right now, we think of a battle against the current presidency and what's been built. And we're thinking of an alternative, which is in the party of the Democrats or other kind of politicians. But in California, we live under a mostly Democratic party community. And we still have the police abuse. We still have the segregation of people. We still have other problems. Our politics, our work, our development, our building of our community has to go beyond what we have today. Has to go beyond what is being built right now. Has to go beyond escaping or responding to this emergency. Has to be built on the dream of those people who were excluded, on the desires of those people whose land was stolen, and then the inclusion of everybody who's been affected by history. And I mean, just to throw this as part of the conversation, and we can continue later on.
Thank you so much, Leonardo. And we do have time for maybe 2 questions. I wanted to see if there are some questions from the chat that we could pose, or if one of the panelists, if you have a question for another panelist, that would be awesome as well.
Well, I had this question here about, do we believe that racism is endemic only to America, or do you believe that racism is a spiritual disease that affects everybody across the world? I don't have the answer, but I think it is very important to focus on the concrete conditions, on the concrete places at this moment. And I think we answer the question by addressing the problems as they're presented to us. And if we're talking about racism and where is it coming from, I think as we transform the current conditions, we're able to transform that reality. And a lot of times we think that we can like answer the question here in our heads, and then later on everything is going to flow. I think by fighting to answer the question through our struggle, through our commitment to change those conditions is important. And I want to connect that to another thing that has happened in our struggle. Whenever we have said no to these things that are being pushed to us as development, they always tell us, don't you want to develop yourself? Don't you want to improve yourself? And I think they put the question right here in our heads. And what we have to say, no, what we're trying to do is the problems of today for the community that historically has been excluded. So it is important to put our struggle and our questions in the concrete facts of our communities at this moment in time in this history.
Thank you, Leonardo. And Jeanne, would you like to say some final thoughts or respond to anyone?
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree with Leonardo that like racism is particular, it's historically situated, and sort of dealing with both that history and then the contemporary material effects of it, I think is kind of crucial. I like this point that Cynthia also put in the chat, that one of the other tactics of liberalism is like, we're gonna help you, right? And so one of the things that if we look at what often happened as you see these movements for school equity and school desegregation, right, is then they're like, oh, what you need is a Dress for Success program. What you need is money for juvenile delinquency. What you need is more policing. And we can see that in the 60s. And if we think about like the walkouts in LA in 68, right, what young people are, Black and Chicano young people are demanding versus what they get, right, which is these kinds of strategies. So I just wanted to highlight that point that Cynthia made in the chat because I thought it was really like useful.
Mm-hmm. And one of our participants, Ross Pelles, wasn't able to join us today, but she is a longtime leader from the civil rights and labor rights organizing in this country and is a survivor of the Greensboro massacre that happened more than 40 years ago, where the police and city government acted in complicity with the KKK and allowed the murder of protesters. Recently, the Greensboro City Council issued an apology for their complicity, but it's important to note that this apology comes after years of organizing by survivors, families, a truth commission, what has happened. And now we're at a time where white supremacy is emboldened, and the city issued this apology showing the power of confronting and organizing against injustice and holding on to truth, no matter what may come, because this is a question of life and death. And, there's a reason why, there's this, Jeanne, you were talking about this, we come to help you. There's a reason why that, that we continue to be disunited, as, Adam talked about. Like, we have to remember that in moments of revolutionary activity, in moments where the system has been completely changed, this has always happened by the most impacted, by the poor and dispossessed, as leaders of our struggle, as intellectuals of our struggle. And when we talk about this issue of systemic racism, we can't stay within this binary that those people who have inflicted this violence upon us try to keep us in, this binary of Black and white. This is an issue of systems, of institutions. We are pitted against one another because those in power want to maintain their power. And they understand that in order to continue these tactics of oppression, of exploitation, of dispossessing people from their land and resources, in order for them to continue this and pursuit of more wealth, of more profit, they can't allow us to see them as the true enemy. And so there are divisions created, because at no point has the oppressor been able to continue to maintain control over society when people are exploited evenly. There always has to be disproportionate and different ways of exploiting people. And so that you can still have, keep Black people with Black people, white people with white people, Mexican people with Mexican people, Indigenous people with Indigenous people, to continue to keep us isolated, so that, when we look over at another person who is oppressed, we're like, oh, well, they don't have it as bad as me, or I don't have it as bad as them. That's not my issue. We have to see the ways that these systems of oppression are intimately connected. And we can only do that by engaging in struggle with one another, by listening to one another, by engaging in solidarity, which comes from the Greek word that talks about to take on the debt, to take on the burden of another as your own. And so when we look at these different issues of systemic racism, of poverty, of extreme violence, of ecological devastation, of the way that religion and spirituality is distorted and manipulated and used as a weapon against poor people, when we're able to see those connections, we're able to unite, and we're able to actually fight from a place of power. And so, oh, I'm sorry, Leonardo, before we close it out, I see that you wanted to.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, someone asked a question about not agreeing with people, with whether the people who were opposed to busing were racist. The issue here, we cannot think in terms of intentions. I think a lot of people have done very racist things while having good intentions, but we need to look at the effects of actions. And a lot of times when we've been opposing all these problems in our communities, people feel attacked. And what we're always telling them is like, it's not about your intentions, it's about the effects of what you're doing. And I think in this time in history, it's very, very important to look at the effects of systems, the effects of language, the effects of our history. So if we acknowledge that the most affected are challenging what we're saying, if we stop and listen, we will stop thinking about how we're being attacked, and we start thinking of the results. So systems change has to do with effects. It doesn't have to do with intentions.
Thank you, Leonardo. And then, Brother Wendsler, would you like to close us out for this panel? You opened us up so beautifully.
There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, I've just been listening to everybody, and it's great. It's really great to hear from being Indigenous and hear the topic, especially with what you summarize. We're talking about greed, we're talking about power, and we're talking about arms of like the government, employer, resources, farming, and goes on. And it divides us. And like our fight is the government, because the government leads right to the power goes to the greed. And we see what they're doing, and I see how they put us against each other. But again, like you're saying, just coming together and uniting and talking this way will formulate, the document that our people, or the strategy that our people in this country needs to follow, because our children don't have that. Nothing against, like in Native people, we have our great leaders too, who've said a lot of things, like Martin Luther King. We have them too. But one of the things that we found too in ours is that it was played with, and at that time, if you look at their communication, they didn't have as good as the communication that we're having today, and I think that's something that they'll be grateful about us having, that we're now all talking, and that's probably one of the dreams that they had, that we would all come to the table. So they did leave something for us, and now it's happening. So now we gotta organized to leave it for the children. And that's why I say that that's where the new beginning will start. But as I said before, that I'm really, really happy that the Native people have become a part of this and this discussion and about just bringing the reality to the forefront. And like I tell many people, I know that the government, the United States, hate to talk to us because we were the ones directly they stole everything from, you know. And that's why I said that if we were to be engaged with all of you and sitting at the table with these people of greed and power, you know, what can they say to us? Because they can't even explain what they did, you know, the first time and how to continue on to everybody else. So I really believe that this is a really great beginning. And I guess it takes me back to some of the old people that are no longer here. They would say, you know, Bikalnanshita, which means the creator of all things, you know, like whatever the people think, how their heart feels, you know it. In reference to the suffering of the people. And then in turn, they turn to the environment, because those environments, you know, talking that when people discount them like they have no spirit, they have a spirit. Because it's just like when we know a tree isn't being watered, we water the tree. When an animal is not being fed, we feed it. Well, they see that in us too. They see the hard times, they see what we're going through. So we pray, you know, we pray with them because they're suffering with us. And so those things are really important because that's what makes change. And I was just telling some of the people earlier that how one individual in Washington was able to delay this land transfer that's happening here on our holy site that's going to be totally destroyed by just doing his work and organizing 4 House of Representatives to kill the bill. And where John McCain finally passed it under, giving it an exemption to all federal laws. But it took one young person that I met when he was, I believe he was like 21 years old going to Wake Forest. And he came down here for the Sacred Run. And then he became a chief of staff of one of the congressmen in California. And he was able to work with 4 people to kill the bill. I mean, that's how quick and how fast it happened when somebody done something right and fair and truthfully. And it's amazing how that happened. So I know that if we teach all our young people like yourself and everybody else that when you guys get into those positions, the right decision will be made. And that's what we got to shoot for. If we're going to keep this government system, if everybody's going to live under it, then we need to remodify that government, because the way it thinks and the way it is not going to supply anything for the future. It's destroying the future. And so, you know, I'm really happy with this conversation, and I kind of want to leave it there, going back to the old people, that they prayed for this day. They prayed for that this day would come, and you know, to be 61 years old now and to be a part of this and say, wow, it is happening. This is exactly what they had talked about from all their prayers, because being as prisoners of war in the 1800s, they just went right into prayer mode, you know, that this evil so strong that it's going to take this energy to defeat it, because everything else it controls. And that where it goes back to greed, the greed of the natural resource of Mother Earth, you know, what gives them that power, but yet the power lies in our spirituality, all of us individually. And it's there, but we just need to, you know, reawaken that. And then it'll help all the suppressed people, because we're speaking for all of them. And I think America has the greatest gift to the world if we build that narrative from healing, and then it'll be the center point of all the teaching around the world, because that's where the bad things happen. But everybody's looking for solutions, and I think we're on it, and we need to keep moving on it. And just listen to everybody talk, you know, it's what a lot of the old people before me wish would have happened. And now they're hearing it. I mean, now we're hearing it, and now the younger Native people are hearing it. So there is hope and faith.
Thank you so much. And this is exactly why, you know, we're calling for a National Truth Commission on race and poverty. And I just want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today. I want to thank all of you all who are attending for joining us. I especially want to thank, I know we've been talking about going beyond the surface to what is underneath and holding it up. And for this conference, for this work, I just want to lift up the amazing people who are holding us from the bottom: Jarvis, Sam, Amy, Nick, Sharon, Leanne, Marie, Reverend Leo, Heather, the incredible ASL interpreter, Shally, who's had our back this entire panel, made us feel good. Thank you all. This is so beautiful. Please stay around for the next session. We're going to close it out with the video. Everybody's Got a Right to Live. This video, the song is being sung by my comrades in the songs in the key of resistance score, Sharon, Pauline, and Luaya from the Peace Poets. Thank you all again and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.